Have you ever imagined working from sunrise to sunset with no right to rest until your body simply collapsed on the ground? This is not a metaphor. It was the reality of millions of men, women, and children torn from Africa by the slave trade and forced to live under the weight of slavery in Brazil and so many other parts of the world. While some punishments of slavery, such as the whip, the wooden stocks, and the pillory, left visible marks in history, there was an even crueler and more silent punishment: working until death. In the sugarcane fields, in the coffee plantations, in the mills, and in the gold mines, the logic was always the same: drain every last drop of energy, treat people as machines, replaceable when broken. The slave quarters were the place of the night, but the real punishment was in the fields, under the scorching sun, when exhaustion turned into a death sentence. Overseers watched every movement, and the silence of those who fell was drowned out by the clinking of chains, the shouts of the foreman, and the weight of the production that could not stop. But why talk about this today? Because understanding this invisible punishment is to understand that slavery did not completely end. Its scars are still present in social inequality, in structural racism, and even in cases of modern slave labor. When we remember the pain of those who fell anonymously, we are also acknowledging the resistance, the struggle, and the hope of a people who, even in the face of death, sought freedom. And in this journey that begins now, we will open the hidden pages of history to understand how slavery turned labor into a weapon, and why this memory cannot be silenced. When we think of slavery, the first image that usually comes to mind is that of the whip tearing the backs of men and women, or the wooden stocks, a prison that tortured bodies and minds, and the pillory, where punishments were carried out in public squares to serve as examples. But there was something even more devastating than these visible punishments. Labor turned into an instrument of domination. It was not only about producing wealth in the sugarcane fields, in the coffee plantations, or in the cotton mills. Work itself was the most continuous, daily, and silent punishment, capable of draining every last strength of those reduced to mere merchandise in the slave markets. From sunrise to sunset, the enslaved were forced to endure brutal workdays. Men, women, and even children were taken to the fields under the severe gaze of the overseer, who monitored every movement. There, silence was not freedom, but oppression. Every strike of the hoe, every cut of sugarcane, every sack of coffee carried on their shoulders was a reminder that their bodies did not belong to them. There was no right to choose, no rest. Only the endless repetition of a cycle of exploitation that turned labor into a slow death sentence. The whip, though feared, was temporary. The wooden stocks, though humiliating, had an end. But exhausting labor never ended. It was the gear that kept the entire colonial system running, the engine of the economy, the secret behind the wealth that financed cities, built palaces, and fueled international trade. Every slave ship that arrived in Brazil brought more arms, more lives condemned to this routine of destruction. And every slave market reinforced the idea that human beings were replaceable. When one fell dead in the field, another was immediately put in their place. This was the power of labor as a weapon of domination. It did not only destroy bodies, but also erased identities. The free African, torn from their land, ceased to be an individual with a name, history, and culture to become a piece, evaluated at auctions, traded in squares, treated as property. This transformation was an essential part of the enslaving strategy. It was not enough to submit physically, it was necessary to erase humanity. And what more effective way to erase it than to reduce a person to a production tool, used until no longer useful? Many historical accounts describe the sudden collapse of workers in the field. Some simply never got up again. For the system, this did not represent a tragedy, but a calculation. It was proof that the machine worked exactly as planned. Labor was not seen as a right or dignity, but as an instrument of punishment, control, and profit. By turning labor into continuous suffering, the mill owners and overseers found a way to discipline without constantly raising the arm of the whip. Fear did not come only from lashing, but from the certainty that there was no escape. The body would be forced to work to its limit, and if it could not endure, death would be just another invisible statistic. This cruel logic reveals why labor was perhaps the most powerful weapon of slavery. It was daily, inevitable, and silent. It killed without spectacle, without alarm, without record. It killed slowly through fatigue, hunger, thirst, disease, and exhaustion. And precisely because it was silent, it became the most efficient punishment, because it needed no witnesses. Every body that fell in the field was buried in the collective memory of the slave quarters, but rarely in the books of official history. But if labor was used as a weapon, we also need to understand the ideology that sustained this system, the justifications that made it acceptable to exploit millions of people to death. It is about this mentality, which turned lives into numbers and bodies into merchandise, that we will talk about in the next chapter. To understand how labor could be used as a weapon of domination until it led to death, it is necessary to dive into the mindset that sustained slavery. The mill owners and large landowners did not see the enslaved as human beings, but as cogs in a profit machine. Every man, every woman, every child taken from Africa by the slave ships was treated as merchandise in the slave market. And if one piece broke, it was enough to replace it with another, acquired in new auctions or brought in the bloody crossings of the Atlantic trade. This reductionist vision turned exhaustion into something not only normal, but even desirable. For the slave owner, death from overwork was not a tragedy, but the natural consequence of an efficient system. Profit stood above life, and the wealth of sugar, coffee, cotton, and gold fields was only possible because millions of bodies were pushed to the limits of resistance. It was not uncommon to hear justifications that linked slavery to divine will or to racial inferiority. These discourses legitimized the idea that working until dropping dead was part of the destiny imposed upon enslaved Africans. In practice, the ideology of exhaustion functioned as a silent fuel. Overseers, responsible for supervising the fields, had the duty to ensure that every minute was used, that every arm yielded the maximum possible. The slave quarters were the space of forced rest, but the true control was in the fields, where production dictated the rhythm of life and death. If one enslaved person fainted, another was forced to take their place. If someone revolted, the whip and the pillory reminded everyone of what happened to those who dared to resist. Exhaustion was not an accident. It was planned. Work hours were calculated so that there were no gaps. From sunrise to sunset, without adequate breaks for food or water, the enslaved were kept in a constant state of fatigue. This extreme exhaustion not only destroyed physically, but also weakened emotionally. A person in exhaustion has less ability to think, to plan, to dream of freedom. In this sense, forced labor not only produced wealth, but also functioned as a psychological mechanism of annihilating hope. Historical records show that many masters preferred literally to spend the life of an enslaved person in just a few years, exploiting them to the limit rather than thinking of preserving their strength for longer. This cruel logic transformed bodies into disposable tools. A man could be purchased today and no longer exist in just a few years without disturbing the enslaving machine. After all, the slave trade continued to bring new lives to replace those who were lost. This ideology of exhaustion was so profound that it shaped the very economic structure of colonial Brazil. Brazilian sugar fed Europe. Coffee became black gold in the 19th century. Cotton fueled factories abroad. And all of this was only possible because slave labor was exploited until the very last breath. The system did not need the whip all the time, because the work routine itself was enough to punish, discipline, and kill in silence. The most perverse aspect of this ideology was the normalization of death. Died of fatigue, replaced, fell in the field, another took up the hoe. This coldness consolidated the idea that black lives were disposable and that colonial wealth stood above human dignity. This logic not only sustained slavery for more than 300 years, but also left deep scars that are still reflected today in structural racism, social inequality, and even in cases of slave-like labor that persist in the 21st century. But while the ideology of exhaustion normalized suffering, daily practice revealed the silent brutality of death at work. It is in the next chapter that we will open the pages of this reality, how enslaved people collapsed in the fields of Brazil, victims of the most silent punishment of slavery. Brazil alone received about 5 million enslaved Africans, more than any other country in the Americas. This human mass fueled sugar mills, coffee plantations, gold mines, and cotton farms. With each slave ship that docked in the ports of Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, or Recife, new bodies were pushed into the slave market, auctioned in public squares, evaluated as if they were animals. There began a life marked by pain, submission, and many times silent death in the fields of labor. The slave quarters, dark and unhealthy, were the space of the night, but the true torment was in the fields, where the sun punished mercilessly. Men and women worked from sunrise to sunset under the watchful eye of the overseer, who stood with whip in hand. The rhythm was relentless, cutting cane, carrying sacks, harvesting coffee, transporting logs. There was no sufficient pause to rest, no food in enough quantity to replenish lost energy, and water was often denied as a form of punishment. The body, treated as a tool, was forced beyond its limits until it could no longer endure. Historical accounts describe the scene of enslaved people collapsing in the fields, too weak to rise again. Some were dragged by companions into the shade, but many were simply left behind. Death by exhaustion had no spectacle. Unlike the pillory or the wooden stocks, it did not serve to terrorize publicly. It was a silent, invisible punishment that killed without noise. The body was hastily buried, without ceremony, without mourning. For the system, it was just another broken piece. The logic was cruel. It was not worth wasting time on the dead. What mattered was keeping production going. If one enslaved person fell, another took over their task. The mill could not stop. The plantation could not wait. This normalization of death at work reveals how slavery turned labor into a sentence. The whip left marks on the skin, but exhaustion erased lives without leaving traces. Beyond extreme fatigue, there were diseases caused by brutal conditions. Dehydration, heat stroke, malnutrition, and infections silently decimated the enslaved. Many fell ill without ever receiving treatment. Death itself was, in some cases, seen as a relief for those who could no longer endure the daily torture. But the greater tragedy was that these deaths were invisible, forgotten, drowned out by the machinery of the enslaving system. The most painful part is that deaths in the fields were not exceptions, but part of the routine. Historians report that in certain regions, the life expectancy of a newly arrived enslaved person was only about 7 to 10 years. This means that many of those disembarking from slave ships would never see old age. They fell in the fields, their names unremembered, their stories never preserved. This silent mortality left deep scars in the collective memory. In the slave quarters, mourning was silent. The companions in labor wept quietly, for even grief was denied to them. There was no time to mourn, no space to stop. Production continued, and suffering was drowned out by the noise of sugar mills, the clinking of chains, and the shouts of the overseers. The silence surrounding these deaths explains why this type of punishment was so devastating. It did not need spectacle, it did not need witnesses. All it required was the weight of the hoe, the scorching sun, and the hunger that corroded from within. This was the daily reality of slavery in Brazil, to die from overwork. But this story cannot be told only through the lens of economy or production. It is necessary to look at the body, at the flesh marked by fatigue, at the soul crushed by a hopeless routine. In the next chapter, we will dive even deeper into this aspect, showing how the bodies of the enslaved were broken day after day until they became incapable of continuing. The human body has limits. It needs food, water, rest, and care. But under slavery, these limits were deliberately ignored. For masters and overseers, the body of the enslaved was nothing more than a tool of production, comparable to a plow or a hoe. If it worked, it was exploited to the end. If it broke, it was discarded. This view reduced entire lives to simple disposable utilities, transforming men, women, and children into instruments of labor, until exhaustion destroyed every muscle, every bone, and every breath. The daily journey began even before sunrise. Hunger was a constant companion, since meals were scarce and of poor quality. Many survived only on cassava flour, bean scraps, or pieces of salted meat, insufficient to replace the energy spent in the fields. Heavy labor, combined with poor nutrition, led to chronic malnutrition. Fragile bones, weakened muscles, and debilitated bodies were visible results of this inhuman routine. Thirst was another torment. On days of intense heat, when the sun burned mercilessly, water was denied as punishment, or simply not provided in sufficient quantity. Enslaved people fainted in the middle of the fields, victims of dehydration and heat stroke. Many did not survive and died right there, without any assistance. Death was quick, silent, and rarely recorded. It was as if these lives had no value beyond the work they produced. In addition to hunger and thirst, diseases spread like flames on dry straw. Malaria, worms, skin infections, and respiratory problems were common, worsened by the precarious conditions of the slave quarters. Without access to proper medical care, small wounds turned into severe ulcers, and simple illnesses became fatal. The weakened body had no way to react, and even when sick, the enslaved were forced to continue working. The rule was clear: to stop meant punishment. There was also what was called sudden death from exhaustion. Men who seemed strong would collapse in the middle of labor, with no more strength to breathe. These were bodies that had reached the absolute limit, destroyed by the combination of heat, extreme physical effort, and lack of basic care. The overseer often did not interrupt production to help. On the contrary, he ordered another to immediately take over the task, while the dead body was removed as if it were merely an obstacle. This normalization of death at work shows how much the body was dehumanized. Enslaved women suffered doubly. In addition to heavy labor in the fields, many were constant victims of abuse, raped by masters and overseers. Even pregnant, they were forced to work until the very last month of gestation. Many lost their children due to complications, and others gave birth in the fields themselves, returning to work only hours later. Their bodies were exploited not only as labor force, but also as objects of pleasure and reproduction. This physical and sexual exploitation left deep scars, transmitted from generation to generation. Children did not escape this cruel cycle. From an early age, they were forced to accompany their parents in lighter tasks, carrying water, feeding animals, or cleaning the mills. As they grew, they assumed the same exhausting tasks as adults. The child's body, still developing, was marked by malnutrition, disease, and punishments. Many never even reached adolescence. The result of all this was an entire population physically broken. Curved backs, visible and invisible scars, calloused hands, and wounded feet were testimonies of slavery. Life expectancy was low, and premature death became routine. This physical destruction was not a side effect. It was part of the system. The faster the body was consumed, the more profitable it was to replace it with another brought on the slave ships. By breaking the body, slavery also sought to break the spirit. But despite all the suffering, the enslaved found ways to resist and survive, even when exhaustion seemed invincible. And it is precisely about this resistance and about the role of women and children in this context that we will speak in the next chapter. If slavery was already a brutal system of oppression for men, for women and children, it assumed even crueler forms. In the slave quarters, in the fields, in the mills, and even inside the big houses, enslaved women bore a double condemnation. They were forced into exhausting labor and were also victims of sexual abuse and daily violence. As for children, from their very first years of life, they were dragged into the same fate, deprived of childhood and shaped by suffering. The day of an enslaved woman began before dawn. In addition to facing the same work days in the sugarcane, coffee, and cotton fields, many were forced to perform heavy domestic duties: cooking, washing clothes, carrying water, caring for the master's children. The female body was exploited to the limit, without any recognition or rest. Pregnant or not, they had to work in the fields under the scorching sun, carrying weights that often put their own pregnancy at risk. It was not uncommon for women to give birth in the middle of the fields, returning to the hoe only a few hours later, as if the birth of a new life were just another step in the cycle of slavery. Beyond physical exploitation, there was sexual violence. Many women were raped by masters, overseers, and even by the sons of the slave-owning elite. Their bodies were treated as property, available for the pleasure of those in power. From this violence, mixed-race children were born, rarely acknowledged by their white fathers. Women, therefore, were forced to carry not only the pain of abuse, but also the burden of raising children born of violence, many of whom were taken from them in childhood to be sold in slave markets. Children, in turn, barely had time to be children. From a very early age, they were introduced to forced labor. At first, with lighter tasks such as carrying buckets of water, gathering firewood, feeding animals, or helping with cleaning. Over time, they began to assume the same roles as adults, enduring endless days in the fields. The child's body, still in development, was destroyed by malnutrition, diseases, and fatigue. Many children never even reached adolescence. Others grew up within this cycle of suffering, already marked by submission and the absence of prospects. Stolen childhood was also marked by symbolic violence. Enslaved children were deprived of their ancestors' culture, forbidden to learn to read and write, treated as merchandise from an early age. They were sold, traded, or given as gifts, as if they were objects with no human value. This theft of identity shaped an entire generation whose memory was marked by pain and invisibility. Even so, women and children played a fundamental role in resistance. Many mothers passed down songs, stories, and African traditions as a way of preserving the identity of their children. In the slave quarters, women taught small gestures of solidarity, sharing a piece of food, protecting a child from the overseers, caring for the sick. Mothers were also protagonists in risky escapes, taking their children with them in search of freedom in the Quilombos. These gestures, even though silent, represented a powerful resistance against the logic of dehumanization. The violence against women and children reveals that slavery was not only a system of economic exploitation, but also a project of destroying human dignity in all its dimensions. The female body, exploited to exhaustion and violated in its intimacy, became a symbol of resistance through survival. Children, torn from childhood, carried in their own bodies the marks of an oppression that spared no one. But beyond physical and emotional destruction, the system also used labor as continuous psychological punishment. capable of destroying hope and the will to resist. It is about this invisible mechanism which corroded not only the body but also the mind that we will dive into in the next chapter. When we think of the punishments of slavery, it is common to imagine the whip, the wooden stocks, or the pillory, visible symbols of pain and humiliation. But there was a less evident, even more perverse punishment. Work itself transformed into psychological torture. It was not only about producing wealth for the masters, but about using extreme fatigue as a weapon to break the minds and spirits of the enslaved. The excess of tasks was not an accident of the system, but part of a strategy. Many times, the whip did not need to be raised, because the imposition of impossible tasks already fulfilled the function of torture. The overseer ordered them to cut more cane than was possible, to carry more weight than the body could bear, to meet deadlines that no human being could achieve. Failure was inevitable, and that was exactly the cruelty. By not being able to fulfill it, the enslaved person was accused of laziness, punished, and forced to start again. This cycle generated a devastating psychological state. The constant feeling of powerlessness corroded hope. Each day, the enslaved understood that no matter how much they tried, it would never be enough. Work became a mental prison, where the exhausted body was only a reflection of the crushed soul. There was no reward, no rest, no prospect of freedom. The mind was trained to believe that the only way out was to submit until the end. In addition, labor as psychological punishment also manifested itself in the comparison among the enslaved themselves. Some were forced to compete to see who produced more, creating rivalries that prevented unity. Others were punished collectively when someone did not reach the imposed goals. Thus, labor ceased to be only physical effort and became an instrument of mental and social control, breaking solidarity and encouraging surveillance among equals. This type of punishment was even crueler because it left no visible marks. The body might not be wounded by the whip, but the mind was imprisoned by fatigue and despair. Many accounts speak of the empty expression in the eyes of enslaved people forced to repeat day after day tasks they knew were impossible to complete. It was as if slavery not only stole freedom but also emptied the soul. And yet, even in the face of this psychological annihilation, many found ways to resist. Some feigned illnesses to rest a few hours. Others performed tasks more slowly, discreetly sabotaging the system. There were also those who, despite exhaustion, passed down songs, rituals, and stories, preserving African memory as a source of hope. Resistance was not only in the Quilombos, but also in these small gestures that defied mental punishment. Labor as psychological punishment shows that slavery did not seek only arms for production, but hearts and minds subdued by exhaustion. It was a silent war against human dignity, waged not only on the body, but also on the soul. But if the system wanted to completely destroy any possibility of freedom, it is also true that resistance was never erased. And in the next chapter, we will dive precisely into this struggle, how men, women, and children found ways to survive, resist, and even build free communities, even in the face of the most silent punishment of slavery. Despite all the brutality, hunger, thirst, diseases, and exhausting labor that led so many to silent death, slavery never managed to completely extinguish the flame of resistance. To resist in this context did not always mean openly confronting overseers or masters. Many times, it meant surviving one more day, preserving traditions, protecting children, or simply not allowing the mind to be completely imprisoned. Resistance manifested itself in small and silent gestures, but also in daring escapes and in the creation of entire communities that defied the system. One of the most common forms of resistance was the intentional slowing of labor. Many enslaved people carried out tasks more slowly, feigned illnesses, or exaggerated pains to gain a few moments of rest. It was an enormous risk, because if discovered, they could be punished with the whip, the wooden stocks, or the pillory. But these gestures, even though discreet, represented a silent cry of humanity, the refusal to be completely turned into a machine of production. Another form of resistance was the preservation of culture. In the slave quarters, even after exhausting days in the fields, men and women gathered to sing, dance, and pass down the stories of their African ancestors. Work songs, often sung in the fields, served to ease fatigue and at the same time to keep collective memory alive. This cultural preservation was a way of affirming, we are still people, we still have identity, even if they try to erase it. There was also spiritual resistance. Many enslaved people incorporated elements of their African religions into the Catholic practices imposed by the masters. This mixture gave rise to religious manifestations that strengthened the community and offered hope. Faith, whether in the Orishas or in the Christian God, functioned as a source of strength to endure pain and to nourish the dream of freedom. But resistance was not limited to the symbolic. There were also courageous escapes. Enslaved people who could no longer bear life in captivity risked everything to flee. Many were hunted by slave catchers, pursued by dogs, and brutally punished when recaptured. Even so, thousands tried, and many succeeded. Those who managed to escape found refuge in Quilombos, free communities built far from colonial control. The most famous of them was the Quilombo dos Palmares, led by Zumbi, who became a symbol of the fight against slavery. These Quilombos were more than shelters. They were spaces for rebuilding life. There, men, women, and children who had been treated as merchandise regained dignity, cultivated land for themselves, preserved traditions, and lived in community. Palmares resisted for almost 1 century, defying the system and showing that slavery was not absolute. The very existence of a Quilombo was already a victory against the logic that sought to reduce people to disposable tools. To resist also meant to care for one another. In the slave quarters, enslaved people supported each other, shared food, cared for the sick, and protected children when overseers approached. This sense of solidarity was fundamental for survival. In the midst of daily violence, small gestures of support created bonds of humanity and strengthened hope. The enslaving system believed it could break not only bodies, but also spirits. However, every act of resistance, from slowing down labor to the founding of Quilombos, was proof that freedom was never forgotten. Survival itself was already a political act, a protest against the silent punishment that sought to kill not only with the whip, but also with exhaustion, hunger, and despair. This resistance, however, came at a high price. Many lost their lives trying to escape. Many were punished to death for small gestures of insubordination. But every life that fell left seeds that blossomed into new forms of struggle. That is why, even today, the memory of slavery carries not only pain, but also pride in the resilience of a people who never passively accepted the yoke imposed upon them. And if resistance was strong, we must also understand the devastating impacts that silent punishment left on the following generations. In the next chapter, we will see how the collective consequences of death by exhaustion marked entire families and shaped the history of Brazil. Slavery did not only kill individual bodies, it wounded entire communities. Every man who fell in the fields from exhaustion left behind a shattered family, a grieving community, and an emptiness difficult to fill. The consequences of silent punishment extended beyond immediate death, shaping the destiny of generations that grew under the shadow of loss and pain. In the slave quarters, mourning could rarely be expressed. When someone died from fatigue, often there was not even a farewell ritual. The body was buried hastily, away from the eyes of the community, and labor continued as usual. Families had no right to openly grieve, for the overseer demanded that production not be interrupted. This forced silence turned pain into an even deeper wound, passed down from parents to children as unresolved memory. Premature death also broke apart family bonds. Women became widows, children orphans, and many young people were sold in slave markets shortly after losing their parents, preventing the formation of stable family units. Slavery, therefore, not only took lives, but also destroyed the foundation of community, the family. This created a collective sense of instability, where no one knew if they would be alive or together with their loved ones the next day. Beyond immediate losses, there were demographic consequences. The life expectancy of the enslaved was low, and death by exhaustion drastically reduced the number of adults capable of protecting and transmitting traditions to new generations. This made cultural preservation difficult and increased the dependence of communities on resistance spaces such as Quilombos, which became refugees not only of freedom but also of memory and continuity. From an economic point of view, silent punishment served the system but left lasting marks on the black population. Generations were deprived of the possibility of accumulating wealth, of passing down inheritance, of building material security. While the enslaving elite prospered, the descendants of those who died in the fields inherited only poverty and exclusion. This structural inequality crossed centuries and is still reflected today in social indicators that place the black population in greater vulnerability. Death by exhaustion also left collective psychological scars. Living under the constant threat of dying at work created a permanent state of fear that spread through the slave quarters. With each companion who fell, the community was reminded of its fragility and of the cruelty of the system. This collective trauma accumulated, creating a legacy of pain transmitted through oral tradition and silent memory. Despite this, enslaved communities found ways to resist erasure. African cultural practices, songs, dances, and rituals were preserved as forms of healing pain and reaffirming identity. Every song sung in the fields, every drumbeat hidden in the night was an attempt to transform loss into hope. This cultural resistance was the foundation that prevented silent punishment from completely erasing the memory of a people. The collective consequences of slavery were not confined to the past. Today, when we speak of structural racism and social inequality, we are also speaking of the legacy of silent punishment. Forced labor until death left scars that did not disappear with abolition. They remain visible in the outskirts, in precarious jobs, in social exclusion, and in the cases of slave-like labor that still exist in Brazil. That is why remembering these deaths is not just a historical exercise, but an act of justice. It is recognizing that millions of lives were stolen, that families were destroyed, and that entire communities were marked forever. It is also understanding that despite everything, there was resistance, there was survival, there was struggle. And it is precisely this connection between past and present that opens the way to the next chapter. Because if slavery seemed to have ended in 1888, its practices in some way reinvented themselves. In the next section, we will understand how silent punishment continues to live on in the form of forced labor and modern slavery, which still haunt the 21st century. When slavery is mentioned, many believe that everything ended with the signing of the Lei Áurea on May 13, 1888. But the reality is quite different. Legal abolition did not mean the end of exploitation. It only changed form, adapting to new social and economic structures. Forced labor, excessive workdays, lack of rights, silence about death, all of this still exists, now with other names. Modern slavery is the direct heir of the silent punishment that marked centuries of history in Brazil. Today, thousands of workers still live under conditions analogous to slavery. They are men and women subjected to exhausting workdays with no right to rest, adequate food, or minimum safety conditions. Many are kept on remote farms without access to transportation, communication, or medical assistance. Their documents are confiscated, their debts increase over time, and fear of reprisals keeps them trapped in silence. This is the new face of slavery, invisible, silent, and often ignored. In rural areas, farm workers still cut sugarcane, harvest coffee, or clear forests under the scorching sun with precarious tools and no protective equipment. Some work more than 12 hours a day, sleep in improvised shacks, and drink water from contaminated puddles. Many fall ill, and some die from exhaustion, without their deaths being recorded as the result of forced labor. Just like in colonial slavery, the logic remains: profit above life. In the cities, modern slavery also manifests itself. Women, especially migrants and black women, are exploited as domestic workers, forced to work without rest, without contracts, and often without receiving wages. There are cases of women who spent decades trapped in households, deprived of freedom, and treated as property. These stories reveal that the past is still alive inside Brazilian homes. Another sector marked by modern slavery is construction. Workers are recruited in poor regions and taken to large urban centers with the promise of employment. Upon arrival, they discover that they are indebted, without decent housing, and forced to work in degrading conditions. The threat of violence, lack of alternatives, and fear of reprisals keep them in a cycle of exploitation that strongly resembles the enslaving system of the past. What is most alarming is that many of these situations are invisible to most of society. Just like in the past, silent punishment continues killing in silence. The exhausted body of today is no longer only in the sugarcane fields, but in construction sites, farms, kitchens, workshops, and sweatshops. The suffering remains invisible, hidden behind walls and gates. The fight against modern slavery requires acknowledging that it exists and that it is a direct heir of historical slavery. The chains may have changed form, but they still bind. The whip may have been replaced by debts, threats, and isolation, but it still hurts. And forced labor, as before, continues to be used as a weapon of domination and exploitation. Fortunately, there are initiatives to combat contemporary slavery. Brazil, for example, has one of the most advanced legislations in the world on this subject, allowing properties caught with slave-like labor to be included in the so-called dirty list. This list, maintained by the Ministry of Labor, publishes the names of employers held responsible for keeping workers in degrading conditions. But even with these measures, the practice continues, especially in poorer regions, where inspections are limited and fear prevents complaints. That is why telling this story is so important. When we remember the silent punishment of slavery in the past, we can see more clearly the forms it takes in the present. And we understand that the fight for freedom, dignity, and justice is not over. In the next and final chapter, we will reflect on how this memory must be preserved so that the voices of those who fell at work are not silenced again. We will speak of the importance of keeping history alive, of teaching new generations what slavery was, and how it still influences today's society. Because forgetting is allowing history to repeat itself. To work until dropping dead was perhaps the cruelest and most silent punishment of slavery. It did not leave only marks on the skin, like the whip, nor did it become a public spectacle, like the wooden stocks or the pillory. It was a daily, continuous, invisible punishment that killed millions of men, women, and children in silence, buried by the routine of forced labor, by hunger, by thirst, and by exhaustion. Every life lost in the sugarcane fields, in the coffee plantations, in the mills, and in the slave quarters was a suffocated cry that official history tried to silence. But those voices did not disappear. They still echo today in preserved memories, in songs of resistance, in stories passed down through generations. Every body that fell from exhaustion also left behind a legacy of struggle, which blossomed in Quilombos, in cultural manifestations, in faith, and in the courage of a people who never passively accepted being treated as merchandise. To resist in that time was to survive. And survival itself was already a political act. The consequences of this silent punishment did not remain in the past. They shaped Brazilian society, creating inequalities that persist to this day. Structural racism, social exclusion, precarious labor, and even current cases of modern slavery are direct inheritances of this inhuman system. When we look at exploited workers today, we see the reflection of those who fell in the fields centuries ago. That is why telling this story is more than rescuing the past. It is fighting against forgetting. It is giving voice to those who could not speak. It is honoring the memory of those who were silenced. Remembering labor as punishment is also denouncing the forms of exploitation that still exist. Because slavery did not disappear, it only changed form. And now, I invite you, if this story touched your heart, do not let it be lost in silence. Share this video, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and help spread the memory of millions of lives that must not be forgotten. Every time we remember these stories, we take another step toward ensuring they never happen again. The chains may have been broken on paper in 1888, but only memory and collective consciousness can guarantee true freedom. And as long as these voices echo, slavery will never be invisible again.